Quiet Place. It's a bad movie. Somebody basically took a poorly written story and swept it under the rug of an interesting concept. Here's my argument. Go. Right from the get-go, the movie opens with a massive issue. We see the Abbott family scavenging through an abandoned town for supplies. We see their 4-year-old son Bo running around the drugstore unsupervised while the parents are collecting what they can in the most silent way possible. How do you two think this is a good idea? You're bringing your 3 children with you into a post-apocalyptic world where the smallest sound will supposedly get you killed. Just watching Evelyn slowly and carefully picking the pill bottle showcases how incredibly cautious they have to be in terms of how much noise they can make. And yet nobody seems to be showing any concern about the child running around the store with nobody to make sure he doesn't knock something over, which he actually ends up doing here in a moment, nearly screwing over the entire family. Why take so many precautions to make sure you don't bump the pill bottles against each other when this kid is arguably making more noise than that ever could have? Why did you even bring these kids with you? I would understand to an extent if everywhere was just as dangerous regardless, but this is established to not be the case. The waterfall is obviously the biggest advantage that you never use. I'll get into the issues this presents later, but wouldn't it be infinitely more safe to take your kids to the waterfall and leave them there while the two of you scavenge? Stealth is made more and more difficult the more people you have with you, and you would think that it would be the best interest of your children's safety to leave them at the spot where the monsters are known to ignore. This is, of course, assuming that at this point they know about the fact the monsters ignore the waterfall, or that they've finished completely soundproofing their basement. It's just so easy for someone to defend the movie by saying they just didn't know yet. However, this is still information that the film has given to us that it is contradicting, and thus is a problem. Unless the parents are willingly bringing their children with them, knowing it's the riskier thing to do. In which case, if you're doing that, then hoo boy. This is simply a tool utilized to create tension because we as an audience know that it would probably be a little bit more difficult to remain completely silent with 3 children with you as opposed to just 2 adults. After he knocks the rocket over and Regan catches it, which honestly should have gotten them killed right there based on how sensitive the monster's hearing is established to be, Bo tries to keep the toy, only to have his dad come and take it away. We're shown that the Abbott family all know sign language, which initially might seem like a bit of a stretch until the audience learns that one of their kids is completely deaf. This would in turn follow that the entire family would know sign language simply for the fact of being able to communicate with their daughter and, in the case of the other 2 siblings, their sister. Thus, the family, from the start, would have a significant advantage in the auditory apocalypse. It's a really well done character moment, and probably one of the best of the film. As unfortunate as that is. The father, Lee, informs Bo that he can't keep the rocket as it's too noisy after he removes the batteries and places the toy perfectly within arm's reach of Bo. This is followed by him and Evelyn straightening themselves up and leaving the store. This is an absolutely brilliant idea. You just told this kid no and expected him to not be a 4-year-old and just grab it off the desk before following you. Not only that, but it is a rather important note that we are in a post-apocalyptic world where if you make a sound, you will die. Wouldn't you want to make sure your kids are within your line of sight at all times? Especially when you are out of your home. You simply walk out of the store and just presume that your 4-year-old is following you without even looking back to make sure he hasn't become distracted with something else. You've somehow managed to keep these kids alive for 3 months, and I genuinely do not know how. Compounded on the fact that Bo seemingly doesn't grasp the dire importance of being silent. So deaf girl, Regan, in an attempt to be kind, gives him the rocket and walks out herself, allowing him to grab the batteries behind her back, and we're then shown them making their way back to their house, walking barefoot across a pathway of sand they've created. Where they got this massive amount of sand, I do not know. The movie never tells us. We get another prime example of the Abbott's terrible parenting as the single file line they are walking in seems to progress by descending age, the 4-year-old being in the back. What the hell are you people thinking? You have quite literally set up a buffet line in order of most easily picked off. This is cartoonish. How have you kept yourselves alive for 3 months with this level of critical thinking? The children should absolutely be in front, with one parent leading them and one bringing up the rear. This is something that animals in the wild do by sheer instinct. How did it not occur to you that this might be the better idea? And this brings us to Bo's terrible decision. I am not accepting that him being a 4-year-old is an acceptable excuse for what he decides to do at this bridge. If anything, him being a 4-year-old should make him even more scared and cautious of everything around him. There are children that are afraid of Winnie the Pooh. I'm pretty sure if you tell a 4-year-old that a bunch of unstoppable apex predators have invaded the earth and will brutally mutilate you if you so much as smack your lips too loud, you will never hear another sound from that child again until one is coaxed out of him by his therapist. In addition, this kid has survived 3 months. You mean to tell me he's managed to stay absolutely silent and thus safe from the creatures until this very moment where he's decided to not? If he's survived this long, that means he understands that he needs to be quiet, not even because of the monster monsters, but because he probably has it ingrained that he'll get in trouble with his parents if he does make any noise, and yet we see him with the toy not even the least bit concerned as it blares out like a dinner bell to everything within a 2-kilometer radius. This kid, apparently possessing the situational awareness of Helen Keller on LSD, evidently doesn't notice his dad sprinting towards him, sharing the same terrified look as the rest of his family, nor the crashing or crunching of the monster barreling through the forest towards him as he continues playing with the toy without a care in the world. But he's dead now, so we can have the illusion of character drama, I guess. After this, we cut to a little after a year later where we see the family is still managing to survive in the dangerous world they've been thrown in. Now, there are actually a few elements to this that are very beneficial to the film, yet quite a few more that are detrimental. The world building through use of the newspaper clippings and the whiteboard are an acceptable way of constructing the reality that our family lives in. Definitely would love to know how they printed and distributed these papers without making noise, but I'm sure I'll never find that out. The execution of such is a bit clunky, however, as the writing on the whiteboard is very clearly meant for the audience and not for him. These points he has written on here are very baseline and unhelpful in terms of defeating the creatures. The only arguably useful note would be the counter, where he has it listed that 3 monsters are in the area. However, even then, this knowledge seems fairly useless in terms of their survival. The amount of monsters that are within hearing range doesn't really affect how quiet they need to be at any given time, as one is clearly enough to devastate their farm should it decide to. On top of that, how exactly do you keep track of something like that? The other notes he has are completely useless in terms of practicality and are used purely for the sake of informing the audience on how the monsters work. Not the worst I've seen, but still a bit strange nonetheless. Instead of having these notes and wasting this whiteboard on useless information, one would think that it would be a lot more practical to have ideas written down on how to damper sound around the farm, or perhaps even a list of supplies they have or need and how they're going to be rationing them for the month. Mechanically speaking, you could even still have these same notes listed, but it would be far more important to leave space on the board for actually useful information. The Abbotts don't need to be reminded that the creatures are blind or that they attack sound. They certainly don't need to have the "what is their weakness" note taking up a quarter of the board. Doesn't exactly inspire faith into your research team there, Lee. Also, how do they manage this farm? They have this massive cornfield and a silo that's shown to be filled with corn. How do they harvest this without making noise? Also, we're shown that Evelyn is now pregnant. This is not only a terrible idea in terms of their survivability, but a terrible idea in terms of narrative. This is clearly a plot device used to create a ticking time bomb, because no logically thinking family would put themselves at this kind of risk. They go through immense procedures at all times to keep themselves quiet. Why would they not take the necessary precautions to prevent conception? Childbirth is loud. Babies are loud. Babies are loud for a very long time. You are putting your entire family in danger because you didn't want to give up sex. However, as I said, there are a few positives of this portion, be them far and few between. It's cool that we're spending some time to get to know the family. The movie really needed more of this. The soundtrack and acting abilities of everyone is amazing. The inability to use dialogue creates a formidable challenge in terms of expressing emotion. This is not just exclusive to this scene, but throughout the entire film. Every single actor in this film is incredible. Their ability to portray their emotions simply through facial expressions is something that not a lot of people would be able to do. This comes down to not just what you can contort your mouth into, but more how your eyes look. This helps incredibly with the immersion, and it's nice to see actors that can pull this off properly. The use of lights as communication is an excellent idea as well, and a good way to get a message across to family members who are either on the other side of the farm or returning from scavenging trips. And, yeah. Yeah, that's about it for the positives. Back to it, I suppose. Why are you lighting a fire here? Fire crackles. Is that amount of noise okay? You can't eat crunchy foods, but you can start a fire. It would be nice for the movie to establish what amount of noise is safe and what amount isn't. We see several other people lighting fires in the distance as well, indicating that the family is not alone. This is interesting and all, but what exactly is the point of this? The Abbott family doesn't seem to be communicating or working with these other survivors in any fashion, so why are they lighting the fires to one another unless it's just a check-in system of sorts? And if that's the case, why are they not communicating with each other beyond that of a basic check-in system? How are any of these other people surviving? Are they living alone? Do they know sign language too? Do they each have their own absolutely silent cornfields? Sure is convenient that they all just happen to be up to start a fire at the exact same time that Lee is. It would be interesting to see the struggles of someone who isn't necessarily as prepared as the Abbotts are. Perhaps that could have been the story, since the movie is fairly lacking in one. Yes, that is true. The movie doesn't really have a story. We're following the survival of a family who go out on a fishing trip at one point, then come home to see monsters tearing their place apart. That's the extent of the story we got. We could have still kept by the Abbott's side if if we had a story of Regan or Marcus getting themselves stranded with another family that's considerably worse off than they were. It's simply interesting because this scene seems to raise more questions than anything else, and its point eludes me, other than setting up the appearance of Old Man Jumpscare later in the film. This is the point we're at in modern horror. We're foreshadowing jump scares instead of plot points. This all brings us to the next scene where we see Regan and Marcus playing Monopoly with cloth pieces instead of the standard ones. They're doing this directly next to a lantern for some reason that Marcus proceeds to knock over and create a very loud crash. I would actually say this is one of the best scares in the movie. The tension is fairly strong as Lee puts the fire out created by the lantern and begins waiting to see if the monsters are going to come. We get a loud bang on their ceiling followed by another jump scare that is 2 raccoons falling off of the roof. This is a problem. Later in the movie, we see Evelyn is dropping a picture on the ground, in the basement mind you, where sound is already dampened, and this draws one of the monsters in. However, the sound of a lantern breaking in the main house followed by the screeching and banging around of a bunch of raccoons doesn't bring one over. Where is the consistency here? We can't even say it was because the monsters were further away in this case because we are immediately shown that one is in the cornfield as it grabs one of the raccoons. Why did it not get any closer to the 2 loud-ass noises that just occurred at the house? How did the raccoons get onto the roof without making any noise until it was narratively appropriate? How have raccoons not been driven to extinction at this point? They don't exactly have the knowledge to remain silent, especially in this scene. Why were you keeping a lantern right next to a Monopoly board where it could easily be knocked over? Why do these parents regularly put their children in harm's way like that? They're getting power from somewhere, even though generators are loud, so I have no idea where from. So why do they have to have a lantern out in the first place? The room is well lit enough as it is. So the next day, we see a shot of Lee pouring more sand onto his silent footsteps trail and one of Regan going into a building that has paint on the floorboards, indicating which ones are safe to step on to avoid creaking. And in these 2 20-second shots, we've raised a whole new explosion of issues. Where exactly are you getting all this sand? You have enough to create a whole road system between your house and town, and even connect them between separate buildings. How in the absolute hell did you do that? That is a lot of sand. Like, that is a lot of sand. Even if you don't live that far from town, that is a monumental amount, and I have no idea where it came from because the movie never tells us. In addition, how the hell did you pull this off? The only way this is even conceivably possible is if you went and tested the boards to see which ones creaked. How did you do that without getting yourself killed? Sure is lucky that there's a perfect trail of non-creaky boards that leads straight to the basement. Regan goes to climb down the stairs into the basement, and her dad jump scares her by pulling her away. No reason for this. The movie just wanted another jump scare. Why would you grab your daughter from behind like that and risk her screaming out in surprise? Why do you even want to keep her out of the basement? Why did she want to go down into the basement? It's almost like you're only doing it as a way to set something up later in the movie. Lee and Regan argue for a moment where Lee tells her not to go down there, and Regan's response is that she's not a child and that she won't make a noise. This is a nonsensical argument that is used in hopes of making the audience assume that the scene makes sense. What exactly is the point of that statement, and how does it counter any reasoning that the father would supposedly give for him forbaying her from the basement? There is nothing that would make Lee want to keep his daughter away from there, as she knows everything that is going on in there already, as presented by the following statements. Moreover, it is no more or less safe than any other spot on the farm. It is arguably more safe because it is underground, and therefore the sound is lessened by the concrete, rock, and dirt. This is artificial drama at its peak. Its entire purpose is to set up the low-effort twist later on that the third act depends entirely upon. I will get into that, don't you worry. So Lee pulls out a new hearing aid that he's been making several versions of to try and give his daughter the ability to hear, and she puts it in and tests it by snapping her fingers. Regan then goes on to take the toy rocket out of the desk drawer, and I am prompted to ask, why the absolute hell did they keep the toy that got their 4-year-old son killed? She takes this toy to the memorial spot of Bo, where she snips a couple of the wires, thus silencing the toy and keeping the lights. What the hell? How did you know what wires to cut to silence it? How do you know it worked if you can't hear the toy to begin with? Why would you even take that risk in case it didn't work? Why are you just leaving the house like there's no danger at all outside? You're just straight up leaving the farm and going to where your brother was killed with the very thing that got him killed when you yourself are incapable of hearing those same sounds that can get you killed. During this point, Lee has taken his son out to the woods in order to learn the necessary survival skills needed to allow him to live on his own should that time ever come. And thus comes one of the most narrative-breaking problems this movie has to offer. During the scene in which Lee is catching a fish, Marcus expresses fear that the monsters will hear him, but Lee promises him that they're okay, as they're next to the river. He assures the boy that small sounds are safe, so long as there is a louder sound to cover it up. And this is followed by a scene of them standing under a waterfall, screaming like a couple of lunatics. Before I tackle any of the other major problems this scene has, I'll address one of the more common criticisms that this portion of the film receives. The question of why they don't simply live next to the waterfall. Now, a couple of the arguments that could be used against this is that the waterfall would not be loud enough to cover up the use of the tools and machinery needed to construct a new home, and or the resources needed to make a new home would be too difficult to get up to the waterfall silently. However, that brings us to the question of what exactly Lee means by saying that small sounds are okay behind loud sounds. What exactly constitutes as a small sound? Clearly they're able to just sit in front of the waterfall and scream their heads off with no repercussions, but would they be able to operate machinery or otherwise incredibly loud tools such as hammers and saws and still trust that the waterfall's noise would mask it? The obviously safe solution to this would be to set up tents instead of building a whole new house and simply camp out at the waterfall as much as they can. Another idea is creating an underground bunker close to the waterfall, which obviously has limitless possibilities depending on the available resources. Scavenging would obviously still be a requirement, and thus the waterfall isn't a save-all option. However, only being in danger sometimes is an obviously incredibly better alternative than being in danger 24/7. On top of this, any of these arguments for the way the movie stands can be thrown out the window with one very prominent fact, and it's that none of the characters ever address this. There is never a point where Marcus asks why they don't spend more time by the waterfall, in which Lee could easily wave it off with a single line. We don't have the resources to build a new home right now. Or, the waterfall isn't loud enough to cover up us building a new home. Or, getting the resources to build a new home up here is too much of a risk. Or, coming up to the waterfall on a regular basis is too much of a risk. Obviously, some of these lines are more effective than others, but the point stands. This is why this is an issue, and this is why it is so prominent of one, because it is so incredibly easy to fix within less than 5 seconds of runtime, and it doesn't make it look like the characters are just perpetuating their own problems for the sake of keeping the story moving. However, the whole idea of how much noise they can get away with brings us into my second point. While it's true that loud sound generally covers up quieter sounds, there's a pretty major variable that is the frequency and pitch of the smaller sound in question. From the brief bit of research I did on the Google, I found that signal masking works at its best when the frequencies of the two sounds match. When one is lower or higher, the sound is still very audible despite the presence of the louder noise. Marcus and Lee's screaming are very obviously higher frequencies than the waterfall. And here's the interesting thing about that. That's based on human hearing abilities. These monsters are supposed to have 1,000 times better hearing than us. How does this work with the case of the waterfall to begin with? Do the monsters just filter out the constant noise? If that's the case, why has Lee not set up a system that plays a constant loop of white noise throughout his farm? Wait. That doesn't work, because at the end of the movie, the monster attacks the TV that has static on it. So if they attack that, why aren't they losing their minds trying to attack the waterfall? The waterfall should be crawling with these things. It would be the most unsafe place in the forest. Why are you both screaming here? Even if you thought it was safe to speak normally, why would you just assume that screaming is also okay? Why would you take that risk? The waterfall doesn't even need to exist. The whole point of the scene is to set up that the fireworks would draw the aliens away later in the film, which we do not need. Any fool who is capable of realizing that the square peg goes into the square hole can make the connection that a louder sound will cover up a quieter one. The waterfall's presence is a problem, and there is no attempt given to fix this problem within the story. I can only attribute this to a lack of creativity or laziness. After this, Lee and Marcus run into Old Man Jumpscare, who rises up just as Marcus is passing. The father and son look down to see a woman, presumably the old man's wife, mauled and dead on the ground. He screams and is immediately killed himself, while Lee and Marcus hide behind a tree. Gee, that sure is super convenient. Was this woman killed just while they were at the waterfall and that's why they didn't hear it? Did Old Man Jumpscare just happen to find her just as Lee and Marcus were walking by? Or did he know that somebody was going to be coming by and he just waited for them so that he could effectively create a new scare for them by screwing them over? I've gone over this a little bit already, but how exactly have these people survived this long anyway? Their house didn't exactly look very well kept or even even habitable for that matter. I find it a little hard to believe that these two were able to live in complete silence up to this particular point where Lee and Marcus were about to walk by. It's almost like these two didn't exist and the scenario was placed here without a care given to the internal logic just so we could get a jump scare. World building be damned. Back at the farm, Evelyn is finishing up some laundry in the basement. She takes a bag of clothes and starts up the stairs with them. As she's walking up, the bag gets snared on the most random ass nail I have ever seen in my entire life. She yanks the bag upward and pulls the nail up with her, and thus the stakes are set. There is now a nail sticking up on the staircase waiting to be stepped on. What the actual hell? There is no reason for the nail to be there. There's even paint over it, so Lee had to have been aware of its existence, yet he did nothing to remove it. This is a problem. This is not just a tiny contrivance that affects nothing. This is a major issue that completely breaks the movie, and I'm going to skip ahead in the film to briefly explain why. When Evelyn's water breaks, she heads down into the basement where she steps on the nail. This causes her to drop a picture, which shatters and brings one of the monsters to the house. This prompts Evelyn to switch the lighting system to red to indicate an emergency, which Lee and Marcus see once they get back from their trip. Lee tells Marcus to set off a bunch of fireworks to get the monsters away, and the two are separated. After Lee reunites with his wife, he goes out to find Marcus and Regan, where he is killed in the process of saving them. See where I'm getting to with this? This nail is the whole reason the ending of the movie happens. It all comes down to a nail that should not exist. A nail that was placed there by the writers to create a quick fix to get the climax they wanted. This is terrible in terms of storytelling. You never want your plot to depend on a contrivance or an inconsistency, provided it is worth mentioning that a contrivance is not as bad as an inconsistency. It would certainly be worse if it were shown that there was not a nail on the stairs prior to this event, but the effect of it still stands. Instead of questioning where the nail magically appeared from where it was not previously, I'm only questioning why it's there in the first place. The nail is holding nothing in place. It is simply there. Not nearly as terrible, but still completely breaking of the story. It is a fundamental standard of storytelling that the internal logic has to be consistent in order to keep from breaking one's suspension of disbelief. This nail creates a precedent that you don't need your story to make any kind of sense for any reason. If this is now the case, anything can go. If this nail is acceptable, then why would it not have been an acceptable alternative to have the bag instead get caught on a grenade pin that causes the stairs to inflate and pop like a balloon? It would have resulted in the exact same outcome in the movie. And if we don't need our movie to make sense internally, why does it matter? So the aforementioned events happen. Evelyn's water breaks at the most narratively appropriate time. She steps on the nail, breaks the picture, monster comes in, she switches on the red lights, which emit a high-frequency ringing that I guess the monsters don't hear. Lee and Marcus come home and see those lights. Lee has Marcus go get the fireworks, and he himself runs into the house to find his wife. During this time, Evelyn is hiding in the basement, and the monster somehow doesn't hear her. But it does hear the timer that she's set to go off, allowing her to run upstairs without it noticing and hide herself in the bathtub. Keep in mind, Evelyn is giving birth this entire time, so she's trying to keep from screaming in pain while hiding from these things. This ends up failing, and she screams right before the fireworks go off while the monster is in the adjacent hallway. She survives this. Lee runs to the bathroom where he finds the tub is filled with blood, and he assumes the worst. Of course, this is just a setup for another jump scare as Evelyn slams her hand against the shower door instead of just opening it like a normal person. Why the hell would you do that, Evelyn? Do you not think that the sound of you doing that would bring the monster back? Conveniently, the baby that Evelyn has just given birth to doesn't make a single sound until Lee is right next to getting them to safety. He takes them down to the basement of what I presume is the barn, where he pulls a mattress over the opening, and as he does so, a brand new avalanche of problems have arisen. First of all, you're telling me that a mattress is going to block all the noise coming out of that basement, huh? From the creatures that have ultra super hearing. Fine, I'm not even surprised at that at this point. However, soundproofing has now been established to be an option. Why have you not done this to the rest of your house? Why have you only done it to the basement in your barn? Why do you not spend all of your time down there until you are able to soundproof the rest of the house? How are you able to hear the monster above you, yet it cannot hear you? You are able to speak normally and simultaneously hear the creature moving around upstairs, yet the burlap sacks and pillows stapled to the ceiling are apparently only blocking talking sound from one direction. The two parents proceed to talk about how Marcus and Regan are still out there. Lee assures her that they'll be okay and they'll know what to do, except the problem is apparently they don't, because neither one of them know to come to the evidently completely soundproof basement. Evelyn does make a comment expressing happiness that the soundproofing worked, yet this changes nothing. Whether or not they knew it worked, the children were apparently never told to go to the possible safe area as opposed to the guaranteed kill zone given an emergency. It's not like they don't know about it. We're shown them putting the newspapers up earlier in the film. Did neither of them think that maybe that's where they should go? Lee leaves the basement to go look for his kids, and we're shown that a pipe has broken and is now going to flood the basement. However, this pipe waits for Lee to walk a certain distance before the water starts flowing, and by some miracle, Lee doesn't hear it. At this point, Marcus has managed to make an absolutely phenomenal amount of noise without there being a single consequence for any of it. He sprints through the cornfield, runs face first into a tractor, and jump scares his sister once she finds him, resulting in a loud smack, yet none of this draws the attention of anything. Right before this, we get our first instance of the monsters being affected by Regan's hearing aid, which she has kept on for some reason, even though we're shown that it doesn't work. The monster is chased away by a high-pitched audio feedback that apparently affects both it and Regan. Regan doesn't notice that this is the case and just assumes that her hearing aid went weird on her for a second, yet she leaves it in while she goes into the cornfield to look for her brother. This is so stupid. Why is she keeping it in when, to her knowledge, it's providing her no use whatsoever and will apparently start randomly ringing and hurting her head? Well, because if she did that, the end of the movie wouldn't happen. Beautiful. So the deaf girl finds Marcus before the super hearing alien does, and the two kids make their way to the silo, where they climb onto the top and wait for their dad to come and get them. They get into an argument about whether he's going to come and save them or not, and Marcus stupidly falls into the mill. Keep this in mind. Meanwhile, Evelyn wakes up to find that the basement is completely flooded. Not only this, but the baby is floating around in its box, with the lid off, somehow, and the monster just happens to be there as well. The baby is completely unaware of everything as it's sitting in its box, cooing and making general baby sounds, yet the monster is straight up not doing anything about it. It doesn't hear this. It's not hearing the baby. The super hearing audio monster that is directly next to the baby does not hear said baby. Okay. Evelyn stands up and picks the baby up, backing herself into a corner as the monster begins creeping towards them. Hang on a second. That thing is clicking, right? It's making a pretty distinct clicking noise. Is that supposed to be echolocation? Do these things have echolocation? Because if they do, everybody in this movie should be dead. So Evelyn starts hyperventilating and whimpering as the baby continues making cooing noises, completely unaware of the danger, and the monster just sits there directly in front of them like a lobotomized dog, utterly ignorant of their existence. This goes on for a decent chunk of time until Marcus, all the way on the other side of the goddamn farm, falls into the silo and the monster spins around and starts running off towards it. Okay. How in the absolute hell was this thing unable to hear the woman and baby practically blowing raspberries into its face, but then instantly picked up on somebody falling through a silo several hundred feet away on the other side of this stupid-ass farm? How is this the only monster that heard it? Why are the hearing abilities of these morons so stupidly selective? Regan jumps down into the silo to rescue Marcus. This is immediately shown to be an awful idea, as apparently corn is effectively quicksand in this universe. Why the door isn't sinking into it, yet they are, is beyond me. It's almost like they just wanted the stakes to be high for this sequence, but couldn't figure out a way to keep them from simply dying here. To keep the tension high, as soon as Regan saves Marcus, the monster drops down into the silo with them. Apparently, it was able to climb the silo completely silently and find the opening. As it attacks the two kids, the corn instantly loses its quicksand abilities, and the duo are able to use the door as a partial shield against the creature. Interesting. I wonder why they were sinking into the corn while there was nothing there, but now that there's a giant monster pushing down on them, they're able to keep themselves safely on the surface. Why isn't the monster sinking? Why isn't all this noise drawing in more monsters? Why? Regan's hearing aid begins giving off the same audio feedback as before, and it begins hurting the monster once again. After a moment of this, the creature finally retreats, tearing a convenient hole for the kids to jump down from. At this point, one would think that Regan would probably make the connection of what's happening. The monster attacked me. My hearing aid began giving up a high-pitched noise. The monster ran away. My hearing aid stopped giving off this high-pitched noise. 2 plus 2 equals... So Lee comes to rescue the two kids, and they are immediately attacked once again by the monster that acts like it can see Lee in this shot for some reason. Marcus decides to screw himself and his sister over by screaming, causing the monster to attack the truck that the two are hiding in. At this point, Regan's hearing aid begins going off a third time, and the monster is held back for a moment. Just when you think the electrodes are going to start going off in her brain, she turns the hearing aid off, allowing the monster to continue to attack them. You haven't figured it out yet, huh? The first time, sure, you didn't see the alien, but in the silo, you quite literally witnessed the hearing aid repelling it. On top of that, if you didn't see any connection, why didn't you turn it off the first time it happened? I can tell you why. It's because we needed an emotional scene of the dad dying. So the monster stops attacking the truck long enough for Lee to sign that he loves Regan, and then he begins screaming to get it off of them. It's truly an emotional scene, and it could have been very compelling if it weren't for the fact that he died for absolutely no reason. It's truly saddening when a movie has to depend on character stupidity to push the plot forward. It's even more sad when one has to depend on character stupidity for a heroic self-sacrifice moment. The fact that Regan didn't just make the obvious connection between the hearing aid and the monster abandoning her was the connecting piece that gave us this pseudo-emotional scene. Although, I may take that back, I was quite emotional and sad to see one of the best characters in the film sacrifice himself from a situation that could have been easily avoided. Perhaps that's not what the movie intended in terms of an emotional reaction, though. As we creep into the final scene of the movie, the kids set the truck into neutral, which apparently makes no audible sounds at all as it drifts down the hill to the house's front gate. Not sure if this was something that they set up to be able to do with the truck or not, but either way, I'm not really seeing the practicality outside of incredibly specific circumstances that they just happen to be in. They reunite with the mother, where they all run down to the basement. Regan begins going down the stairs towards said basement, and it is played out and built up as if she's going to see something amazing that none of us have seen before. Once she gets down there, she proceeds to act surprised and shocked at the reveal of everything we've already known about from the beginning of the movie. Shots show the whiteboard, newspaper clippings, surrounding TVs, and radio setups. This is treated like a big reveal, which is a bit strange. I wonder why they would do that. I wonder if I'll be coming back to it. Needless to say, the alien follows them down here, even though none of them made a sound, but it's not like that matters based on how these things' hearing seems to fluctuate in sensitivity depending on which scene we're on. There's a tense scene in which Evelyn is holding a shotgun and waiting for it to do something until Regan, completely out of nowhere, looks around the TVs and radios and suddenly makes the connection between the hearing aid and its ability against the creatures. This is what the big reveal show is for, and that is why they wanted to set it up. Allow me to string this together for you now. Regan wanted to go down to the basement for an untold reason, and her dad stopped her. Why? So we could get a jump scare. They get into an argument about it. Nothing is resolved, and nothing is established on why he doesn't even want her down there to begin with. Why? Well, it's a segue for him to give her the new hearing aid that he's been working on in said basement. The hearing aid does not work, yet she keeps it on. Why? Well, so that when we get to the cornfield and silo, we can see that it has an adverse side effect on the monsters. She doesn't see that that's what's happening, yet for some reason she doesn't take it off or silence it until the third time it happens. Why? Well, it was the perfect time to cut off character resources so they could kill off the main character and allow him an emotional farewell. Now she's in the basement for the first time, and she saw that Lee was working on other hearing aids and that the monster attacked a TV that had static on it, so therefore she makes the connection that the hearing aid hurts the monster. Yeah, that makes sense. This is peak storytelling. So Regan turns the hearing aid back on, and the monster is immediately thrown off as it twitches in pain from it. Instead of running away like it has before, though, it just stands in the basement freaking out until Regan sees a microphone sitting on Lee's desk. She takes the hearing aid out and puts it against the microphone, where Lee's gigantic stereo system amplifies the feedback to an astronomical decibel level, peeling the alien's armor back and allowing Evelyn to shoot its head off. Where am I going to start with this? Why in the absolute hell does Lee have a microphone set up to a speaker system? What point could that possibly serve in the situation that this family is in? You people replaced Monopoly pieces with cloth, created sand trails all the way to town, soundproofed the barn's basement, ate soft foods to avoid crunching, created a lighting system for communication, painted the floorboards that you deem safe to step on, and then proceeded to hook all of your speakers to a microphone that you have plugged into your basement. Seems like a bit of an oversight, but maybe that's just me. Also, so this family just happened upon the one thing that can kill these things on accident. Nobody else figured it out. You mean to tell me that this thing was taken out with one shotgun blast to the face, and the entire United States military couldn't figure out how to beat them? The United States military, which has tanks, bombs, light machine guns, rocket launchers, firearms that use 50 caliber ammunition. The armor protects them against all of that, huh? And not a single person in the military, or outside of the military for that matter, thought to use high-pitched noises against the monsters that can hear really well. Yet this random family out in the middle of nowhere stumbled across it by accident with their homemade hearing aids. Evelyn and Regan look over to the television sets where it shows through the security cameras that the shotgun blast has brought the other two monsters in the area to them. Apparently, they didn't hear the silo being ripped open, or the truck being attacked, or Marcus falling through the silo, or the constant screams of the one monster that was wreaking havoc across the property, or Marcus sprinting through the cornfield, or Lee screaming, or Marcus screaming, or the fireworks, but they both heard this one random gunshot in the basement. Okay. Evelyn and Regan exchange knowing looks with each other before Regan ups the volume on the speakers and Evelyn cocks the shotgun before the movie cuts to black. This movie was a disaster. A Quiet Place is an interesting film. While it was an absolute train wreck in terms of writing, characters, and world building, it managed to obtain a massive fan base of people who adored it. Because of this success and praise, a sequel is currently in the works, and I'm not too optimistic about it given its predecessor. Now, the movie actually does have a really good premise. An amazing one, in fact. The whole idea of creating a modern-day silent movie in the style of a horror thriller is an incredible concept, and one that could have created something amazing. However, concept alone is not enough to carry a story. One can have the best story idea in the world and still execute it in a fashion that makes it horrible. The writing was constructed in a way that facilitated false conflict between characters. Solutions to the family's problems were supplied, yet completely ignored in order to keep the stakes and tension at their highest. The aliens are a problem all in of their own. The movie doesn't even try to hide the plot convenience that is their hearing. Despite how the family treats the smallest whisper as a threat against their lives, they can apparently get away with quite a lot without actually attracting the attention of anything. Snapping your fingers? Fire crackling? Sprinting through a cornfield, screaming in a bathtub before the fireworks that are supposed to cover that sound go off. That's all fine. However, when the scene calls for it, there will always be an alien perfectly within earshot of hearing whatever tiny, insignificant sound that anybody makes. This is just one of countless contrivances that the movie suffers from, ranging in destructive severity from finding old man jump scare right when he decided to end his life, to a nail hammered in at the perfect angle to be stepped on right when the movie needs to come to an end. Characters are quite literally dumbed down so the movie can continue, or exist for that matter, as these aliens should have been destroyed within 15 minutes of landing based on how easy they are to dispose of. The military probably could have killed them all before the public even knew about it. Regardless of the fact that the family could have lived next to the waterfall, or at least chosen to go there more often, they could have soundproofed their home, as this was proven to be a viable option. Yet instead, they chose to keep themselves in danger for the sake of the script. This is the kind of storytelling that we want to avoid in our writing. It is important to maintain a level of consistency among the rules of our story, our characters, and our monsters in order for the stakes and plot to hold up against this kind of scrutiny. For without standards, we lose the one thing that means so much to us all: a good story. Other than that, though, the movie was pretty good. Good premise, 10 out of 10.